What's going on, guys? It's Cimoooooooo. So today I'm bringing to you my top 5 competitive budget decks for the July 2018 format. Even though national season is just about come to a close, and there really isn't a lot of mainstream competitive events to compete in until the World Championship, until the regionals start going for next season, that doesn't mean you guys have to quit playing Yu-Gi-Oh! You guys can still play a very good competitive deck at your local game store, and you can probably build any of the decks I'm going to mention in this video for about $100 to $150 at most, and that's counting both main and extra decks. So before we get into that, I want to give a huge shout out to my newest patrons, as always. So big shout outs today to Cimoooooooo's Harry Daring, whatever the hell that means, and Psycho. You guys are the reason that this channel is growing strong. And if you guys want to help support me in the channel through Patreon, then check out the Patreon link in the description below. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. Starting off with number 5, I've got True Draco. Now, True Draco has been a deck that's managed to make itself known on the competitive scene, especially this past format. It's kind of died down a little bit. It hasn't been nabbing as many tops as it did in the initial part of the format, but that doesn't mean the deck isn't very viable. One of the best things that I love about Draco, especially now with the release of Battles of Legend Relentless Revenge, is the fact that Dragonic Diagram got a reprint, which means that this card is going for about $4 to $5 US at the moment, and that really brought the price tag of this deck down significantly. The only real card that's expensive in this deck now is Card of Demise, still sitting at about $15 a copy, but realistically every other card in this deck is incredibly cheap. And the best part about playing Draco, you don't need to play an extra deck. Sure, if you want to spend the money, or maybe if you want to have some Ghost Reaper targets, feel free, but the best part is you don't need the extra deck. And honestly, the deck's kind of better off without it because it gives you more options that you wouldn't otherwise be able to play. While True Draco is a stun deck at its core, really just trying to slow the game down, bring other decks to your level, and you can just beat over them with these really big monsters that also happen to generate you advantage, I really like that True Draco can also go second very well because of the True Draco spells and traps, being able to pop them, and also just getting advantage by doing that by taking out your opponent's cards while also generating advantage for yourself. So it's very good at setting up turn 1, but could also pretty much pick apart boards at will going second, and I think that's why all around it's a very solid number 5 choice. But moving on to number 4, we have a deck that's done a little bit better on the competitive scene lately, so I feel I had to include it, and that deck is Paleozoic. Paleozoic, again, is an incredibly cheap deck when you look at it because aside from, again, Card of Demise, every card in this deck is incredibly cheap because essentially all the cards that were in here came at the common rarity, and that's really good for budget players. Paleozoic's actually been making a pretty big splash in the competitive scene as of late. Sure, it hasn't been winning any events, but it's been able to take the top cuts, and not only the European World Championship qualifier, but also the North American World Championship qualifier, and I think that definitely says something. Sure, the format's still dominated by Trickstar, Sky Striker, and Gouki, but the fact that a deck like this is able to compete, I think is a testament to how powerful the deck truly is. Now, one of the big weaknesses is that it is a going first deck. You can go second with it, but obviously it has its weaknesses when it does go second. I think Draco's a little bit better in that respect, but at the same time, compared to Draco, you're generating advantage off of every single floodgate you're activating by being able to recur your Paleozoic monsters from the graveyard, and not to mention, totally awesome, is still one of the craziest boss monsters a deck realistically has ever had, and so if you're able to just get out of a Starboy and a double totally awesome board, you're probably going to end up winning that game. One other thing I like about Paleozoic, though, is that because the deck is pretty much all in common rarity for the most part, you're also able to afford some hand traps. Now, this is obviously depending on your budget, but being able to afford stuff like Ghost Ogre, Droll and Lockbird, Effect Veiler, underneath the price tag of $100 to $150, in addition to the rest of this deck, is very feasible. Now, Infinite Impermanence is probably a little bit out of your price range, but if you can afford it, it's a nice upgrade to the deck, and that's kind of why I had to give Paleozoic the number 4 slot, because Draco has the inherent weakness that it can't play all those hand traps because you're playing stuff like Demise, and that's kind of how the deck is essentially going to function. So that's it for number 4. Moving on to number 3, we've got another deck that, you know, it really is just one of the best decks of this format, but is actually rather inexpensive, and that deck is going to be Pendulum Magician. Now, Pendulum Magician managed to take second place at the North American WCQ, it won the South American WCQ, and also managed to take top slots at the European WCQ. Now, the biggest thing I really like about Pendulum Magician is that it has a fantastic Sky Striker Trickstar matchup. It actually really just dominates that matchup because that matchup very much struggles to get over big monsters that also have built-in effect negation. I mean, we already know Trickstar Sky Striker hates dealing with big monsters, but what's worse than that is when you have stuff like Vortex Dragon or Jackal King that can negate the effects that might possibly be able to get over those boards in addition to that. And that's where a deck like Pendulum Magician really shines. Now, one of the big problems here is that Electromite is still about a $20 card, and you're probably going to need 2 to 3 copies if you want to play this deck to the most efficient levels, but realistically, outside of that, there aren't many two other expensive cards in the deck, since a majority of the deck was printed in Pendulum Evolution, so there are a plethora of copies of all the cards you're going to need in abundance. Now, hand traps are a different story, again, very similar to Paleozoic. You can play some of the more budget hand traps like maybe Ghost Ogre, Droll and Lockbird, or even Effect Veiler. Ash Blossom's probably going to be out of your price range if you're pretty much trying to adhere to the budget that I've set, but that doesn't mean the deck isn't very good, because one of the things is with Pendulum Magician is that since it's a very combo-focused deck, and you're trying to get just as many Pendulum monsters and combo pieces as possible, you don't really need to rely on those hand traps a lot of the time. Now, obviously going second, if you're going up against Gouki, not having those hand traps is going to be a problem, and honestly can just be the reason you lose, because if they set up that extra link, it's going to be a rough time. But having a really good matchup against one of the best decks of the format, while also having maybe not so good of a matchup against the other best deck, I still think is a pretty fair compromise considering the value you're getting for playing this deck. Now this moves us on to number 2, and for number 2, we've got Burning Abyss, a timeless classic. Dante is still going strong. I honestly can't believe it, but realistically, Burning Abyss is a very, very cheap deck. Again, all the cards in this deck pretty much come at like the common or the rare slot. I think one of the most expensive cards outside of Dante that you're really going to need to acquire is Blackluster Soldier, and that's mainly due in part to Burning Abyss's popularity and the fact that people are running triple BLS, so the market's going a little bit crazy at the moment, but you can get common copies of BLS for like $4 to $5, not really breaking the bank. But again, I've already reiterated, but since the deck is so cheap, you actually have a lot of room to be able to afford some hand traps here. Again, Ghost Ogre, Ghost Reaper if you really want to go there. Ash Blossom, again, is a little bit on the expensive side, but if you can manage to afford it, getting some copies for this deck, this is probably going to be the deck that you would be able to afford Ash Blossoms more so than the other 3 we've already discussed on this list. And that's a really good thing if you're wanting to play this game competitively, because you have to consider the fact that you can use those Ash Blossoms or you can use those hand traps in basically any deck that you're ever going to build, especially if you're looking to become a more competitive player. So investing in those hand traps might be a good option for you, but also do keep in mind that the Megatins are right around the corner, and Ash Blossom might even get a reprint, which means that, you know, we might have a much cheaper option to get Ash Blossom, making it even more affordable and more accommodating for these budget builds. But going back to Burning Abyss is just one of the most persistent decks because it's able to recur so many of its resources. Beatrice is still a phenomenally powerful card, and the fact that the deck can just really outgrind, it doesn't really care about going first or second, it's able to break boards rather well, and we've seen that, you know, it won the UK National Championship, and it just manages to make the top cuts of the North American and the South American, as well as the European World Championship qualifier. I take that back, I think it only got 69th in North America, but it was up there, and there were still plenty of people playing the deck, especially very well-known players. So that's just a testament to how good the deck is, and something you really might want to consider, especially with Cherubini still yet to be released, might be a pretty good investment for the future. But that moves us on to our number 1 competitive budget deck of July 2018, and that deck is gonna have to be Dinosaurs. I gotta give credit to Dinosaurs because this deck, out of all the decks that have been making the top cuts of these national championships and these WCQs, Dinosaurs have just really gotten in there, and for the price you're able to play this deck, it's just extreme amounts of value. Dinosaurs pretty much just comprise of a majority of the cards from the Dino Smashers Fury structure deck, but the nice thing about this is it's very similar to Burning Abyss. You can afford to purchase hand traps to play great in this deck, and especially since Gouki is a very prevalent threat in this format, you're gonna want to have a deck that can most likely play hand traps if you can afford it, because you're gonna want to have something to potentially try and stop Gouki from going off. But even if they manage to do so, you've still got a very powerful deck at your disposal. I mean, you've got a ton of consistency cards in Fossil Dig and Oviraptor. You've got Ultimate Conductor Tyranno, which is just an absolute monstrosity of a card. The deck is super aggro. It's not the most consistent, but it pretty much does what it does, and it does it very well. And as we've seen, out of the fact that it's been able to top multiple of these various events around the world, it's really proven itself to be probably the best competitive option that you don't really have to spend a lot of money on, and I think that's why I had to put this at number 1. It just goes to show that you don't need to spend $8, $9, $1,000 on a Sky Striker Trickstar deck, or you don't need to buy a Gouki deck. You can get a deck for a very reasonable price and still make it very par at some of the most highest of tiered events for the entire season. So with that said, Dinosaurs well deserving of number 1, and it's probably the best place you're gonna want to invest your money. But guys, those are just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about your best budget decks moving into the July 2018 format. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. And if you found this video helpful, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.